Let us move ahead and take up the next concept for discussion, that is contract combinations. So friends, by far we were discussing about situations where there was a single contract and there were multiple assets involved, and we were trying to separate each of the asset as if there are different lease arrangements. In other words, single contract had been segmented into different contracts, each asset considered as a separate lease. Now we are talking about exactly a reversal situation where there may be multiple contracts, two or more contracts, but taken up with the same supplier, that is same lessor, and the assets under each of the contracts taken in a way that these assets are to be used as a single component. If you remember the example of cinema hall that I have discussed some time back, now if I reverse the situation now is you have taken a contract to use a cinema hall building, you have taken another contract to use cinema hall equipments, you have taken yet another contract to use cinema hall furniture. Now these three assets are such assets which cannot be used independently, but now there are three different contracts that you have entered into with a lessor. So you are a lessee having three different contracts, and these assets are actually to be used in conjunction, and therefore it makes sense to consider this whole as a single lease component. So we are now trying to merge different contracts as if it is one single lease component. So friends, as per Ind AS 116, there are three conditions given. Any one condition you fulfill, it is enough. So just take care of one thing, any one condition needs to be fulfilled. Condition number one, you have negotiated all these assets as a single package. Second condition is the price of one of the asset depends upon the price of the other. That means the lease rental that you have decided for one depends upon the negotiation of the other. And third, the whole combination of these assets appear to be a single lease component. So when any of these three conditions are met, any one condition out of the three, you can combine multiple lease contracts as if it is a single lease component. However, one thing cannot be ignored, these all contracts should be entered into at the same time or nearly at the same time, and secondly, all these should have a common party as supplier. Means if these contracts are taken from different parties, definitely you cannot combine all of them. So let us write up note about this. Two or more contracts entered into at or near the same time with the same counterparty be considered a single contract if any one of the following criteria is met. So out of the three conditions, as I have mentioned, you just need to fulfill any one of these conditions. First condition, first criteria is the contracts are negotiated as a package with an overall commercial objective that cannot be understood without considering the contracts together. Or second condition, the amount of consideration to be paid in one contract depends on the price or performance of the other contract. Or the third condition is the rights to use the underlying assets conveyed in the contracts are a single lease component. So friends, write this much quickly and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and talk about the next concept, that is portfolio application. Now here it may so happen that an entity has entered into lease arrangements of similar type of assets. So the similar type of asset, but there are multiple number of assets. So if you can look into one thing, suppose a railway company has taken rolling stocks for multiple number of such units, and there are multiple lease arrangements, but all these lease arrangements indicate same type of asset. In such cases, if you could see, it makes no sense to go for asset by asset or lease by lease basis if there are multiple number of assets, whereas the functioning of all the assets is similar, and it makes sense to consider all this as if it is a singular arrangement. So here comes concept of a portfolio. So instead of accounting for lease by lease basis, you sum up all of these and use a portfolio approach for reporting. Now this is again a practical expedient available in the standard, that is under Ind AS 116. There is no compulsion, it is a choice given to the lessee. If the lessee wants to do this, lessee is definitely allowed to do this. So let us write up the note about portfolio application that we have just discussed. Entity having a large number of leases of similar assets may face practical challenges in applying the lease accounting on a lease by lease basis. Ind AS 116 allows entities to use a portfolio approach for leases with similar characteristics if the entity reasonably expects that the effects on the financial statements would not differ materially from the application of the standard to the individual leases in that portfolio. So friends, write up this note and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and talk about the next concept, that is inception and commencement of a lease. Now if you ask what is the meaning of inception of the lease, someone would say beginning of the lease. What is the commencement of the lease? That is also beginning of the lease. So you might get confused if you are not clearly aware of what is the difference between inception and commencement of a lease. So friends, inception of the lease is first of all important to identify whether a lease exists in a given contract or not. In other words, when the two parties get involved in a contract where there is a possibility that there may be a lease, these two parties would first raise a question, would first make an analysis whether a lease is present in this contract or not. Is there a lease arrangement involved? This assessment is made at a date, and that is called inception date. So what is the meaning of inception date? When the two parties agree for conveying the right of use of one asset by one to the other, that date when the parties agree, the contract entering date is called the inception date. So what would be the commencement date? The date at which the two parties actually execute the contract. That means the performance begin. For example, on January 1, 2020, I enter into a contract with a party to take a premises on lease, and the lease shall begin from 15th January 2020. So contract was entered into on 1st January 2020 and the lease actually begins from 15th January 2020. So in that example, 15th January 2020 shall be considered as the commencement date and 1st January 2020 will be the inception date. So friends, inception date is the date when the two parties agree. That means the contract is signed or they agree for principal terms of the contract. It is that date at which the decision is taken by parties whether a lease is involved in the contract or not. On the other side, commencement date is the actual execution of the contract, where you can consider commencement date as the date on which the lessor conveys to the lessee the right of use of the asset that belongs to the lessor. Now, some important factors should be understood over here. Friends, in general business terms, what happens When we take some classrooms on lease for live classes, or when we take places like this studio for a lease, the place is taken on a lease, but then this will be a simple looking ordinary office building. We have to give it a structure of a studio. That means we have to develop all these interiors and designing the way we want. In such case, this takes some time. So what happens, suppose it takes 1 month time. I would always request the lessor that please give me some time, that I don't pay rent for that period, and let me make the benefit of the space available for just developing or modifying the infrastructure, and the asset needs to be prepared before it is used. So actually I am using the building little later. So assume that on 1st April I have obtained the right of using a building, but I will start paying rent from 1st May. 1 month has been given as the interior designing period, or you can say modification period, by the lessor. Thanks to the lessor has agreed not to charge any rent. In such case, rentals begin from 1st May, but the right of use has been conveyed on 1st April. So the commencement date will not be 1st May, it will be 1st April. So friends, remember one thing, even if the rent payment is delayed, even if the actual operations are delayed, which is the date on which the lessee obtains the right to use, the right to control the use of the asset, or right to direct the use of the asset, that date onward you will say that the lease has commenced, and that date is called commencement date. Friends, these dates are also important so that you can understand what is the lease term. Now you are going to consider lease term as the duration of the lease. So it has to have a specific start date and a specific end date. So we will have to talk about what date the lease will start, what date the lease will end. For this purpose, it is not the inception date that will be considered as beginning of the lease, it is the commencement date which will be considered as beginning of the lease period. So friends, these important points what I have discussed needs to be written down. So let us write up the note about inception and commencement of lease, what we have just discussed. Ind AS 116 requires customers and suppliers to determine whether a contract is or contains a lease at the inception of the contract. The inception date is defined as the earlier of the following dates: date of a lease agreement or date of commitment by parties to the principal terms and conditions of the lease. So friends, quickly take note of this whole thing and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing about inception of the contract. Now let us write something about commencement of the lease, what we have already discussed just now. So the commencement date is defined as the date on which lessor makes an underlying asset available for use by a lessee. In certain cases, the commencement date of the lease may be before the date on which the rents become due and payable. This often occurs when the leased space is modified by the lessee prior to commencing operations in the leased space. If lessee is given control over the use of underlying asset before it begins operations or makes lease payments, the lease term has commenced even if the lessee is not required to pay rent. So friends, all these points we have already discussed. Quickly take note of this and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing even this part. Let us now move ahead and write something more about inception date and commencement date. So Inception date is the date when an entity shall assess if the contract is or contains a lease. It is the commencement date on which the lessee initially recognizes a lease liability and related right of use asset, that is ROU asset, and the lessor, particularly for the finance leases, initially recognizes its net investment in the lease. That means the lessor and lessee both are recognizing the leases at the commencement date. This is something important. So accounting entries begin from commencement date and not from the inception date. I have already explained you this point. Be careful while writing this whole thing. You should be very clearly distinguishing what is inception date and what is commencement date. Write few more lines ahead. The lease term begins at the lease commencement date. So when we say there is a term called lease term, that is the duration of the lease, it will always begin with the commencement date, not at the inception date. And ROU asset is defined as an asset that represents a lessee's right to use an underlying asset for the lease term. So friends, I told you earlier, sooner we are going to step into the accounting part of it, but so that you should be comfortable with the accounting part, you should be very clear with the theory part, what we are discussing and writing notes right now. So quickly take note of this and then we shall move ahead. Alright friends, you would have finished writing this whole thing. Let us move ahead and now talk about the next concept, that is lease term. Now friends, before you learn the accounting for leases, you first have to understand what is the lease term, what is the meaning of lease term and how to determine the lease term. For example, when you are accounting for lessee, so in the books of the lessee, when you recognize an asset or liability relating to lease, you will first be asked to find the present value of all the future payments. Obviously, unless you know what is the total period of lease, how will you trace the cash flows of those future periods and how will you find the present value? It is very important for someone to identify that what is going to be the total duration of lease, whether it will be 3 years, 5 years, 8 years or 10 years or 20 years, you have to define that first. That is what we call as the lease term. Now friends, in order to understand what is lease term and how to determine it, please carefully pay attention to the examples that I am putting forward. Once you understand these examples, then when I bring forward the requirement of Ind AS 116, you will understand that requirement easily. So first, let me explain something called a lock-in period. Suppose I have taken a premises on lease for 5 years. However, the lease contract is very clearly conveying one fact, that out of the period of 5 years, the period of 3 years initially will be considered as a lock-in period. That means the lessee and the lessor both have agreed for having this lease contract for 5 years. That means the lessor has agreed to convey the right to use the building for 5 years. However, out of 5 years, 3 years is such a period, the initial 3 years is such a period where neither the lessee nor the lessor will have right to cancel, and that is why that period is called non-cancelable period of the lease or lock-in period of the lease. So in that example, out of 5 years, 3 years will be considered as a non-cancelable lease period. Whether to include the other 2 years or not is the point of question. That means out of 5 years, 3 years is definitely part of lease term, whether we should include those 2 years or not. So the agreement between the lessee and the lessor was drafted this way, that the premises have been given on lease for 5 years, lock-in period is 3 years, and the lessee can decide whether to renew the lease for the later 2 years or not. That means the renewal option or the extension option is resting with the lessee. Now, at the commencement date, it is the lessee whose viewpoint has to be considered. So, lessee is having reasonable certainty to exercise the option of extension of that 2 years. In that case, at the commencement date, the lessee is aware of the fact that 3 years is a non-cancellable period of the lease, and the other 2 years lessee itself is reasonably certain to extend the lease term, or you can say to exercise the option of extending the lease term of the later 2 years. In that case, the lease term will not be just 3 years, but it will be 3 plus 2, 5 years. So, if you can understand what we have defined over here, lease term is equal to 3 years plus 5 years. When I technically define this 3 year and 5 years, I would say lease term equals to non-cancellable period of the lease plus the extension period, provided the extension option is reasonably certain to be exercised. In other words, at the commencement date, whether we should include that 2 years or not should be based upon reasonable certainty that lessee will exercise that option after 3 years. If the answer is yes, that means if there is reasonable certainty of exercising that extension option, those 2 years will be part of the lease term, else not. Let us now introduce another concept within this lease term, that is termination period. And let me explain the role of this termination period along with an example. So, now I am taking another example. Suppose I have taken a premises under lease for 10 years, and the contract of lease includes the fact that the lessee will have termination option available at the end of 6 years. That means lease term is 10 years originally stated in the contract, but the lessee will have a choice of terminating the lease by end of 6th year. So, if I am lessee, at the commencement date I have to decide, should I take the lease term as entire period of 10 years or I have to take only the initial 6-year period. One thing is very sure, till expiry of those first 6 years, lessee does not have right to cancel the contract. In that case, we can consider the initial 6 years as a non-cancellable period of the lease. Now, we will include those 6 years definitely in this lease term. Whether later 4 years should be included or not is the subject matter of this question. So, idea is very clear. You have to again look at the reasonable certainty of exercising or not exercising that termination option. Because it is a termination option, we would say at the commencement date, if the lessee has reasonable certainty of not exercising the termination option, then you will include those 4 years also as part of the lease term. However, if there is a reasonable certainty that lessee will exercise termination option, then you should not include those later 4 years. So, with respect to the extension option, at the commencement date, there should be reasonable certainty that lessee will exercise the extension option. With respect to termination option, we would say at the commencement date, the lessee should have reasonable certainty of not exercising that termination option. So, friends, whatever we have discussed, we need to write down this whole thing. And one more precaution that you have to take, don't ever get confused between these two dates, that is the inception date and the commencement date. Certain things have to be decided at the inception date, certain things have to be decided at the commencement date. What should be included in lease term cannot be decided at the inception date. You have to test all the conditions at the commencement date. It is commencement date from which the accounting begins, and therefore at commencement date you have to finally define what will be the lease term. So, friends, let us write a note about this. So as we have just discussed, lease term will be the aggregate or summation of the following. Number 1, non-cancellable period of lease. Second, period covered by an option to extend the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. And number 3, periods covered by an option to terminate the lease if the lessee is reasonably certain not to exercise that option. And friends, what we have further discussed is all these assessments have to be made at the commencement date. So that is again very important. So the last line that you would write is the assessment of whether it is reasonably certain that a lessee will exercise an extension or termination option should be done on lease commencement date. So do one thing friends, write up this whole thing and then we shall move ahead.